either of you gentlemen can tell me who you plan to support in the upcoming 1988 caucuses.
Who's running?
And so, with a mere 169 weeks to go before the fateful day of decision, the mood here in Cedar Rapids is tentative, yet cautious, wary, yet uncertain, thoughtful, yet prudent. And as to that choice that these and these people alone will be making, one thing is certain. Only time will tell. This is Jeff Greenfield for Nightline, Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Thanks for staying up later. I'm Bob Costas. With us tonight, ABC's Jeff Greenfield, who might be called the Jay Leno of Nightline for two reasons. During the political season, he's the Monday night fill-in on a regular basis for Ted Koppel, just as Leno is for Carson. But more tellingly, you're a guy who likes to use some humor and some irreverence in his coverage, and that isn't all that usual in your business.
This is a business where the work often isn't serious enough, but people take themselves incredibly seriously. And every once in a while, I just like to remind viewers, and I guess myself, that there's a certain tendency to overdo it. Maybe we ought to remember that there's a lot of humor, sometimes conscious, sometimes unwitting in this business.
And some of that humor is generated by the correspondence and by the business itself. I remember one, you did a self-mocking piece late 1984 or early 85, and you went to Iowa, and the notion was, hey, only 3.5 years away from the caucuses, the tension is almost too much to take. And as they put your name up in front of you, it would be Jeff Greenfield, thoughtful correspondent.
Right.
And then at the end, the closing commentary was labeled mindless drivel.
This is true, which is exactly what it was. I had the trench coat. I had the thoughtful, pondering look on my face as I strolled through some part of Cedar Rapids. We visited a slaughterhouse because hogs are big in Iowa. Right. We interviewed airline clerks to see if anyone had made reservations for 3.5 years from then. It was just a way of saying, whoa.
When you use footage from the Three Stooges to illustrate a point about the Dukakis-Bush debates, or when you flippantly suggest that a good choice for a running mate for George Bush might be Billy Martin, because after all, he has experience in key electoral states like Michigan, New York, Texas, and California, and he did manage in all those states. What do the wise old heads say about that sort of thing?
Actually, they encourage it because at least my bosses at ABC know full well that there is an awful lot of a portentous style in political coverage. There is that kind of the world is about to fall down, the Westbrook Van Voris, and so as a nation holds its collective breath, the world waits and and the real answer is probably not. I mean, you would never do that in a genuine crisis, in a moment of tragedy. But what you want to say to the audience and to us is, the world keeps spinning, it's going to go on, let's put this in perspective. And also, as you know, because you use it in your own sports reports a lot, humor is a great teaching tool. People remember humor.
But just as I hope is the case in my work in sports, if you didn't know the nuts and bolts, if you weren't solid on the straightforward material, you couldn't get away with the use of humor. So if you weren't a lifelong political junkie who has at his fingertips a ready reference, a parallel between what Eisenhower did in '56 regarding Stevenson and what Bush is now trying to do with Dukakis in '88, if you didn't have that sort of material down, the humor would wear thin quickly.
Did Eisenhower run in '56?
I believe he did.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's the same year Mantle won the Triple Crown.
Now we're talking.
Right? Elvis was on the Sullivan Show. Does this help you in any way?
Now it's all kicking back. I do remember. In fact, I think that's the point. I always think that I do a lot of reading, and people sometimes make fun of me, because when I went to the convention, I brought the Greenfield Memorial Library, which was 2 cartons of books, because I need to know it, even if I can't get it on the air. I need to know that history so that I know at least what I'm leaving out. As you know, this medium is very frustrating in terms of time. So if you can't deliver all the complexities, at least you know that the simplicities you're delivering are grounded.
Did you experience a little bit of a star's rush this past year when you became not just correspondent, but anchor on a regular Monday basis for Koppel?
Well, luckily, the Monday night shows, which air after those interminable Monday night football games, which always seem to go on for 7.5 hours, I was actively rooting against overtime so we could get on the air, weren't seen by hundreds of millions of people all over the world.
But all the political junkies, your constituency,
it was a very gratifying year, and I would be a hypocrite and a liar and a fool not to say so. I'd always wanted to work the floor of a convention. They gave me the ideal role, go on the floor, but don't grab interviews with the sewer commissioner of Chicago, remind us of history. If you have a little humor, use that. It was like being paid to go to a baseball game. They also, you will notice, if you look at the podium, decided that red, white, and blue was too busy, too blatant. So we're all going to stand up tomorrow and sing Every Heart Beats True for the salmon, turquoise, and gray. As Jerry Ford once said in another context, if George M. Cohan were alive today, he'd roll over in his grave.
Similarities and differences between you and Koppel?
Koppel knows a lot more about international affairs than I could ever hope to. I, on the other hand, know far more about baseball and rock and roll than he could ever hope to.
He knows zip about those subjects.
I have
serious flaw in his makeup.
Said to him publicly how you can be the most respected man in America when you don't know baseball and you don't know the difference between, you know, the Cleftones and the Penguins is beyond me.
Yeah.
But he has these other attributes that people seem to like. I suppose the one most obvious comparison, which I don't raise willingly, is that when Koppel began, everybody said he looked weird to be an anchor. He doesn't look like an anchor, and they certainly say that about me.
They've said you both look a little like Alfred E. Newman, right?
Yes, that's, you know, what can I tell you? I assume they mean the theologian.
Absolutely. Or perhaps Al Newman, the Twins utility infielder.
Or the Academy Award-winning film editor.
I am no one at this point to pass any judgment. You notice this haircut I'm working on here? I mean, this is one of the major embarrassments of my life.
No, I'd vote for you for Interfraternity Council President in a minute.
Yeah, this is like, you know, you go to camp.
Yeah.
This will hold you from, like, June 15th to September 1st.
So there is that, I mean, there is that parallel, that Koppel wasn't supposed to look like an anchor, although I think he looks just fine. And they certainly, as I say, raised that about me. On the other hand, it has an advantage. One of the weirdest compliments I ever got was years ago. I was speaking out at some press meeting, and somebody came to me and said, you know, it's just always so gratifying to see you on the air. And I started to puff up, and they said, because it's so clear, they said, that you weren't hired because of your looks. You live and learn.
What's funny on a regular basis in covering politics? What never fails to tickle?
The best, I mean, this is a small point, but when aides to a politician attempt to explain away a glaring weakness, for instance, whenever a press secretary tells you about a candidate, you know he's great in small groups. This means the man cannot put two words together in public, which is, after all, as Winston Churchill and others have showed us, something a politician should know how to do.
It's the equivalent of saying that a blind date has a good
great personality.
Yeah.
And it leads to the same results, which is get me out of here. The other kinds of things is when a politician says something genuinely awful, they will always tell you, the aides, you have to put it in context. Now, if a guy says, you know, death to all Catholics and Jews, it's hard to put that in context. Yeah. So it's often the attempt to take language, which is, after all, the bedrock on which politics is built, and explain away the corruptions and malfeasances of language that politicians do all the time.
Jeff Greenfield, for one night at least, staying up even later than Nightline.
AT&T also shows us small business types confronting disasters through a camera that looks as if it woke up with a king-sized hangover. So the irony of big business ads trashing the image of big business, I don't know, did that irony come through? Did this piece make any sense? Did we have enough time to explain it? Or did we just waste all this money and effort? And then what happens to me and my career? Sometimes this news business can really be a jungle.
Stay tuned. Later, we'll be right back.
CBS as kind of their media commentator. On one occasion, you ripped half of their nightly schedule, right?
Just about all of their primetime fall schedule, yeah.
And what was the reaction like after that?
Well, I'd been there for not that long. This was a show called Sunday Morning, which was and is a gem.
Right.
And they said, we want you to be the media critic, and you're going to have to say what you mean. You know, you're going to have to pretend you don't work for CBS. The bizarre thing was, a couple months later, I ran into Bill Paley, who was then the chairman of CBS, who had seen it. He said, boy, you were pretty rough on us. And I said something clever like, hamana, 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 famous Ralph Cramden quote. And he said, well, that's okay. That's what you're there to do. So the reaction really was, well, that's what he's there to do. They knew going in that if they were going to do this offbeat show with a different sensibility, one of the things they were going to get from a media critic was call him as you see him.
Critique Nightline.
Awfully good show. Sometimes gets into a rut, and we have some problem with the same old faces. because when you're throwing a show together on short notice, you tend to go with the people that you know can perform. Koppel is, I think, unquestionably, of course, present company accepted, the best interviewer probably in the history of the medium in terms of listening to people and eliciting information and, as you know, juggling that incredible business.
What about the recent criticism that, which sort of follows up on what you just indicated, that Nightline, for all its excellence, goes back to the same wells too frequently, back to certain office holders, back to certain representatives of interest groups, and they're predominantly white males in positions of power, so that certain legitimate parts of the spectrum are not adequately represented?
To some extent, the criticism's right, and in fact, there was one area where we don't get enough critics of American foreign policy on because we technically have the capacity to go to the other countries. We're more likely to put on a Sandinista from Nicaragua than with an American critic of foreign policy, and that's fair. What's not right is this country is run now, not just mostly by white males, but by conservatives. Nightline is a show that brings on people in positions of power and challenges them. So it's wrong on two counts, in my view. One is, the day this country elects a liberal left government, that's who you'll see on disproportionately. Second, the fact that you have somebody on doesn't mean that person's getting a free ride.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of white male conservatives who probably feel the worst thing they ever did was to come on Nightline.
So the bottom line, short answer is that the history of Nightline virtually overlaps the Reagan and now Bush administrations.
Yeah. That is much better than I said it, yes.
Let's change the direction here briefly. As a young man just out of Yale Law School, you found yourself working for Bob Kennedy. What are your most salient recollections?
Well, I mean, that, you know, to start your professional life in a presidential campaign with Robert Kennedy in 1968, that insane year, you don't forget that very easily. In fact, I never have. The two things that I remember most vividly are, on a light note, he had a wonderful sense of humor and was very self-mocking. I mean, he would often peer out the door of an airplane and turn back to the press and he says, "Now, I counted, there were 50,000 people here, and they're all wildly enthusiastic for me." He was able to make fun of a lot of the more pompous parts of politics. Maybe that's where I got some of that notion to do the same thing here. The night Martin Luther King was killed, when Robert Kennedy had to walk into a ghetto late at night in Indianapolis where thousands of blacks had been waiting for him, they did not know. And he had to tell them, face to face in the middle of the night, that Martin Luther King had been murdered. And he then launched into this talk about the pain he felt when his brother was killed. He quoted Aeschylus to this crowd, obviously something that he'd read over and over again, and told them that what we needed was not division and hate, but love and understanding, and go home and say a prayer for Martin Luther King. It's a moment that you just can't ever forget.
In the seconds immediately following the news, before he launched into his own remarks, in fact, he had delivered a news bulletin to this crowd. What was the reaction like?
A gasp, just shock, just as though they'd been physically struck.
People weeping?
Yeah. But
most of them stayed and listened.
Oh yeah, stunned. I mean, he was. I hate to put it this way, but he was ministering to them, and that was the one night when he came back later. It's the only time I ever heard him mention the assassination of his brother. He said something very cryptic, like couldn't even get the guy's name right. He said that Harvey Lee whatever set something loose in this country. That's the only time I ever heard him directly refer to that.
Would his style have to be changed 20 years later, or would the very attributes that worked well for him in '68 have transferred to the modern situation?
Well, look, in some ways it's unfair for me to even think about that because the emotions that run through that experience, you know, the first fellow I ever worked for, I still think the most remarkable public figure I ever saw, the intensity of that time of 1968 is too much for me to give you an objective answer. My own feeling is that quality, the hard-headedness and compassion that are together, the almost laser-like intensity about, well, how do you know that? The skeptical mind he brought to kind of conventional liberal answers, I think is what's got. I think it's one of the reasons the Democratic Party has come to its present state. That Robert Kennedy could talk compassion, but he wouldn't lose the blue-collar workers of Indiana. He wouldn't lose the farmers of Nebraska. They sensed something about his tensile strength that was, I think, real. I have a feeling that not only would not be out of place now, it's what the Democratic Party intellectually and emotionally most desperately needs.
Back with Jeff Greenfield, you've been on both sides of the fence. Take us through what it's like preparing George Bush, or a candidate, in this case Bush is the example, for his interview with Dan Rather, and preparing Rather for the same experience.
Well, in fact, one of the problems, I think, was that the CBS people keyed Rather up too much for an adversarial process. I mean, Rather is a very intense fellow. That's one of his assets as an anchor. He comes through that screen very powerfully. But you don't need to gear him up. In the case of an anchor, what you want to do is simply lay the facts out for him and say, all right, it's a live interview, and here, here's what he might say, here's what he said before, and here's what he hasn't answered. And we need to explore that. In the case of a politician, it's actually a kind of latent sadism that helps if you're a political advisor, because what you get to do in the living room before the debate is to beat the devil out of the guy, because he has to hear the hardest questions that can be asked. You're of no service to him unless you pound away at him and say, look, Mr. Vice President, you're lying to us. Let him hear the most shocking possible thing that an interviewer could ask him. And I am sure, by the way, to a moral certainty, that Roger Ailes, who was a very smart media advisor, said to Bush, look, if that so-and-so says a nasty enough thing, say to him, how would you like to be judged by those 6 minutes when you walked off the set?
No way that just occurred to Bush spontaneously.
There is, no. And it's not just because George Bush's capacity for ad-libbing is not enormous. It's that line is too sharply defined as a counterpunch for it to be an ad-lib. It's not something you could use on Rather walking onto the set. Hi, Dan, why'd you walk off the set? It's a counterpunch, and you need to be taught. Wait for it, and if he hits you hard, that's what you come out.
Along those same lines, do you think that Benson could possibly have been primed for the possibility that, look, Quayle's credentials have been assailed, and he's going to say, well, I'm a young senator, I'm about the same age that Jack Kennedy was, and if he talks about Jack Kennedy, be ready.
That's what happened. That's not if, that is a yes. It sounds like it's all mechanical and manipulative, but ask any lawyer who's going to argue before the Supreme Court. They all do practices. They bring in their own friends and colleagues, and they go through the practice round because there's too much at stake. You wouldn't go on a 90-minute show in which your political future was on the line, the election of a president or vice president, without prepping it. And it often comes in very handy.
In light of that, what would you have done if you were Dan Quayle's advisor?
When?
Right after he's been selected. You woke up this morning, Dan, and you've got a chance to be vice president of the United States.
Right. Well, the problem is that they put him out on a press conference where there were 15,000 journalists in New Orleans with no story. And that was the first time when we had what was called later the deer caught in the headlights look. And that's what triggered the whole subsequent press outpouring of criticism of Dan Quayle. And one thing you might have done, if you were George Bush, is to let him know 5 days earlier that he's under serious consideration, and then send some of your experienced people out to work with him. Because part of the problem, doesn't explain everything, was that this was a guy who'd never really been in the national limelight. He'd been a senator for 8 years, and half the people covering Capitol Hill didn't know a thing about him. And so when you suddenly, in fact, the Republicans on the convention floor doing what is called spin patrol, when they were coming to people like me saying, go easy on him, you don't understand, we're saying, all use the same line. It's like getting a guy out of high school football and telling him he's starting the Super Bowl.
If you had been Gary Hart's campaign manager, the day after the Miami Herald came up with the Donna Rice thing, was there any way out of this? Or was it just run up the white flag and get the heck back to Colorado?
That's right. Where Gary Hart needed the advice of his campaign manager was 4 days earlier. And indeed, he was getting that advice from his people. I had suggested publicly, I mean, not to him, he didn't ask me, that he simply get up and say, I lead a different kind of life. In other words, when you are falling off the mountain, as a Sid Caesar character once said, what you should do is flap your wings and try to fly. The odds are against it, but you got nothing to lose. Gary Hart was not going to convince anybody that what happened there was an in-depth meeting with a fundraiser or an expert on Guatemala. All he could do was to get up and say, look, this is who I am, this is the life I lead, it's the life that probably half of all American men, if not more, and half of all American women lead. Yes, it's true. Now, what's the next question?
Stick out his chin and in effect say, so?
Yeah. because there was nothing else to have done. Now, I don't think it would have worked, because this is, you know, this is not the kind of country where we know the names of the mistresses of the prime minister. As I said before, the presidency is uniquely an office where people invest that individual with all kinds of personal attributes, and they don't think of it as just a job where you knock off work and then go and, you know, have whatever fun you have. So I think once that happened, you could either try to brazen it out or throw in the towel.
We're going to throw in the towel for a second. We'll be back. Finishing up now with Jeff Greenfield. You'd had some success in the media, but it took a while before your mom finally said, all right, you made the right choice.
Yeah, I'd never taken the bar exam after getting out of law school, and this always rankled. And then in 1980, I was an analyst at the conventions, and at one point, Cronkite said to me, he said, "Well, you can explain this probably better than I can." And I figured at that moment that it was okay with my mom, that I was not going to be a lawyer. This was a reasonable line of work to pursue.
Cronkite's stamp of approval was Mom's.
I think so. She trusted him a lot.
Jeff Greenfield. See you later.
Join Bob tomorrow night when his guest will be the prize of Palm Beach, Roxanne Pulitzer.